They called each other friends, the greatest partnership in history. But beneath the smiles and telegrams, Roosevelt and Churchill fought a quieter, colder war of their own. Between 1939 and 1945, the Allies weren't just fighting Hitler, they were maneuvering each other for power, for empire, for the shape of the post-war world. This is the story of two men who trusted each other only as far as they needed to, and betrayed each other just enough to win. Fact 1. The Atlantic Promise That Was Never Meant to Be. August 1941. Aboard the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, off the coast of Newfoundland, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met for the first time as leaders of their nations. They prayed together, smiled for cameras, and signed what would be called the Atlantic Charter, a document declaring freedom, self-determination, and the end of colonialism. To the world, it looked like the birth of a moral alliance. But to both men, it was the first act of political deceit. For Roosevelt, the charter was a promise to his own conscience. He wanted to lead the world away from empire, to dismantle the old colonial order Britain had built. For Churchill, it was a performance. Britain was fighting for survival, not ideals. The Prime Minister signed the document knowing that its principles directly contradicted the foundation of the British Empire. When he returned home, his cabinet reminded him that self-determination could mean losing India, Burma, and Africa. Churchill privately reassured them, "This is no law, it's a declaration." Roosevelt saw the charter as a weapon, a moral lever against British imperial arrogance. He would use it later to pressure London into granting independence to its colonies and to position the United States as the new global leader. Churchill saw it as a necessary illusion, words meant to secure American support before the US entered the war. Each man believed he had deceived the other. What neither realized was that this paper agreement marked the first fracture in their special relationship. From that moment, Churchill began to suspect that America's real goal wasn't to save Britain, but to replace it. And Roosevelt, ever the strategist, began planning a post-war world where the British Empire would no longer stand between him and global peace on American terms. The Atlantic Charter was celebrated as a symbol of unity. In truth, it was a quiet declaration of rivalry. One believed he was preserving an empire, the other burying it. Neither would ever admit it aloud, but from that ship in the North Atlantic, the betrayal had already begun. Fact 2. The empire Roosevelt wanted to dismantle. By 1942, Britain was still fighting for its life, and Roosevelt saw an opportunity that no American president before him had ever dared take. He admired Churchill's courage, even his eloquence, but he despised the empire he defended. In Roosevelt's private view, Britain's colonies were no different from the tyranny they claimed to oppose. He once told his son, "I can't believe God put us on this earth to be ruled by the British Empire forever." When Churchill came to Washington that year for war planning, Roosevelt had already begun shaping the post-war world without him. Behind closed doors, his advisors, men like Harry Hopkins and Sumner Welles, drafted plans for a global trusteeship system, an American-led alternative to colonial rule. They discussed India, Burma, Malaya, and Egypt not as British possessions, but as future independent nations under international guidance. Churchill was not informed. In public, Roosevelt smiled and called Churchill his partner. In private, he used America's growing economic leverage to corner him. Every ton of food, every ship, every crate of weapons that reached British hands came through Lend-Lease, an American program Roosevelt carefully controlled. And with every delivery, he quietly reminded Churchill that Britain's survival depended on US mercy. Churchill understood the game. At a dinner in the White House, he tried to appeal to Roosevelt's sentiment, speaking of the moral duty of the English-speaking peoples. Roosevelt listened, smoked, and said softly, "Winston, when this war is over, the people of India will not be fighting for you. They'll be fighting for themselves." It was a warning disguised as empathy. To Churchill, Roosevelt's talk of freedom was hypocrisy, the rhetoric of a nation that had no colonies left to lose. To Roosevelt, Churchill's defense of empire was the dying breath of a system that had ruled the world for too long. In the following months, American officials began directly meeting with Indian leaders, bypassing London entirely. Churchill exploded when he found out, accusing Roosevelt of meddling in domestic matters of the empire. Roosevelt's reply was calm, almost cold. Democracy cannot stop at Dover. The two men still appeared side by side in photographs, raising cigars and victory signs. But beneath the smoke, they were no longer allies fighting a single war. They were rivals, one fighting Hitler, the other quietly fighting history itself. Fact 3. The oil deal behind Churchill's smile. By 1943, victory seemed possible, but for Churchill, survival meant something more than defeating Hitler. It meant saving what was left of Britain's empire. For Roosevelt, it meant something different entirely, ensuring that when peace came, the empire would no longer dominate global trade, especially oil. The Middle East was the prize. Before the war, Britain controlled vast reserves through companies like the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and Royal Dutch Shell. America's oil giants, Standard Oil and Texaco, wanted access. Roosevelt agreed. He believed oil was the currency of the new century, and whoever controlled it would shape the peace to come. When the two leaders met in Casablanca in January 1943, the cameras showed affection, cigars, laughter, friendship. But inside the private rooms of the Anfa Hotel, their staff clashed bitterly. Roosevelt's advisors demanded open access to Middle Eastern resources after the war. Churchill refused, arguing Britain had fought and bled to defend those interests. "We shall not trade our empire for gasoline," he snapped. Roosevelt's reply was dry, almost cutting. "You may have to if you want dollars to pay for the war." From that moment, the betrayal turned economic. American planners, Dean Acheson, Harold Ickes, and Averell Harriman, began working behind the scenes to dismantle Britain's oil dominance. They used Lend-Lease as leverage, quietly inserting clauses that limited British control over post-war trade agreements. In 1944, Roosevelt personally met with King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia aboard the USS Quincy. Churchill was not invited. That single meeting changed everything. The United States secured a direct alliance with the Saudi kingdom, bypassing Britain entirely. From that moment, London's century-long grip on the Persian Gulf began to crumble. When Churchill learned of the secret deal, he was furious. Roosevelt's men called it practical diplomacy. Churchill called it a stab in the back. But Roosevelt saw it as the birth of a new order, one in which no nation, not even Britain, could monopolize the world's lifeblood. "Empires have no future," he told his cabinet later. "Resources must serve mankind, not kings." For Churchill, who had built his life defending empire, the phrase sounded like a verdict. The man he thought was his friend had just rewritten the map of the modern world, and done it without firing a shot. Fact 4. The betrayal at Tehran, November 1943. The war had reached its turning point. For the first time, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met face to face in Tehran, the capital of Iran. Officially, the conference was about finalizing the invasion of Europe. In reality, it was about the future of the world, and Churchill was about to discover that his greatest ally had chosen a new favorite. From the first hour, Roosevelt played a quiet but deliberate game. He positioned himself closer to Stalin, both literally and politically. At the conference table, he sat beside the Soviet leader, leaving Churchill isolated at the far end. It was a symbolic gesture, but one Churchill never forgot. Roosevelt wanted to charm Stalin, to show that America, not Britain, would be the new partner of the East. Churchill, who had spent years warning about Soviet ambition, watched as Roosevelt laughed with Stalin over jokes made at Britain's expense. "The Prime Minister looks tired," Stalin quipped during one session. Roosevelt smiled. "He's had the empire on his back a long time." The room burst into laughter, and Churchill's face turned to stone. Behind closed doors, Roosevelt discussed post-war Europe directly with Stalin. He offered concessions, promising a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and even suggesting moving Poland's borders westward. Churchill was informed after the conversation had already taken place. For him, it was more than an insult. It was a revelation. The special relationship he believed existed had become a convenience, and he was no longer the center of it. That night, in his diary, Churchill wrote, "The president loves power, and he loves to play the mediator between giants. He thinks he can tame the bear. I fear he may instead feed it." Roosevelt's goal was strategic, not personal. He believed Stalin's cooperation was essential to ending the war quickly, and that Britain's colonial obsessions only complicated peace. But in his calculation, he had traded something intangible: trust. Churchill left Tehran humiliated, convinced that the United States was no longer Britain's shield, but its rival. As their convoy departed the Iranian capital, Roosevelt waved warmly, calling it a great success. Churchill muttered to an aide, "The eagle and the bear have shaken hands," and the lion was not invited. The betrayal at Tehran wasn't written in treaties or telegrams. It was written in glances, laughter, and silence. And from that silence grew a deep suspicion that would never heal. Fact 5. The D-Day deception that Churchill never forgave. By early 1944, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, Operation Overlord, was in final preparation. It was the moment Churchill had long awaited, the liberation of the continent and Britain's redemption. But in the shadows of the planning rooms, another quiet betrayal was unfolding, one Roosevelt's generals concealed from their British ally. For months, Churchill had pressed for a Mediterranean strategy, believing that striking through Italy and the Balkans would protect British interests and block Soviet expansion. Roosevelt disagreed. To him, the Mediterranean was a relic of empire. The decisive blow must come through France, under American command. Behind closed doors, U.S. Chiefs of Staff, Marshall, Eisenhower, and King began quietly shifting authority away from London. Decisions once made jointly in the combined Chiefs of Staff were now taken in Washington. Churchill sensed it, but could not stop it. When Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of Overlord, Roosevelt announced it to the press before even informing Churchill personally. To the British Prime Minister, it was a deliberate humiliation, a reminder that the age of British leadership was over. "The Americans," he wrote bitterly, "have taken the steering wheel, and I am left to cheer from the back seat." But the deeper wound came from what Churchill did not know. American intelligence, working with select British officers loyal to Washington's chain of command, launched Operation Fortitude, a deception designed to mislead the Germans about the true landing site. To protect the secret, information was compartmentalized, and Churchill himself was excluded from certain briefings. It was an extraordinary decision. The leader who had inspired resistance through the darkest days of the Blitz was now deemed a potential security risk, not for disloyalty, but for his tendency to talk too freely. When Churchill learned months later that entire branches of British intelligence had operated under American oversight without his approval, he was furious. Roosevelt downplayed it as operational necessity. Yet to Churchill, it was more than military discipline. It was a declaration that Britain no longer commanded even its own war. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops stormed Normandy, Churchill stood in silence at 10 Downing Street, listening to the radio reports. The invasion was a triumph, but not his. The cables, the strategy, the timing, all bore Roosevelt's signature. Britain was now the junior partner in the war it had once led. He congratulated the president with grace, but that night told his private secretary, "We have won the greatest battle in history and lost the empire in the same breath." D-Day would be remembered as the dawn of liberation. For Churchill, it was also the day he realized the British century had ended, signed away not by defeat, but by alliance. Fact 6. The secret bargain at Yalta, February 1945. The war was nearly over. Hitler's empire was collapsing, and Europe trembled on the edge of a new order. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met once again, this time in the Crimean resort of Yalta, to decide what that order would be. To the world, it was a meeting of victory. To Churchill, it would soon feel like betrayal written in diplomatic ink. Roosevelt arrived sick, exhausted but resolute. He was already thinking beyond the war, about the United Nations, about global stability, and about America's new place at the head of it all. He saw Churchill's concerns about Eastern Europe as outdated imperial thinking. "We can't fight yesterday's wars," Roosevelt told an aide. "Let the old empires fade. A new system must take their place." During the private sessions, Roosevelt made a quiet, fateful deal with Stalin. In exchange for Soviet participation in the war against Japan, he promised territorial concessions in Asia, Manchuria, the Kuril Islands, parts of Sakhalin, and, more critically, a free hand in Eastern Europe. Churchill protested, arguing that Britain had fought to keep Europe free, not divided. But Roosevelt brushed him aside, saying, "Winston, we need the Russians to end this war swiftly. You can't build peace without them." To Churchill, it was unthinkable. He had spent years warning of Soviet expansion, only to watch his closest ally grant Stalin half a continent. He begged Roosevelt to insist on free elections in Poland, the very nation whose invasion had triggered the war. Roosevelt agreed, in words. But the wording of the Yalta Declaration on liberated Europe was deliberately vague, its promises unenforceable. Churchill saw it for what it was, a diplomatic illusion designed to calm British fears while ensuring Soviet cooperation. That night, he walked along the Black Sea coast with his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. "We have been outplayed," he said quietly. "The Americans will wake up one morning and find the Russians on the Rhine." Roosevelt, meanwhile, believed he had achieved a masterpiece, securing Soviet entry into the Pacific War and the foundation of the United Nations. But he underestimated the cost. Within months, Soviet troops dominated Eastern Europe. The free elections never came. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria all fell under Stalin's shadow. When Churchill later called Yalta the greatest tragedy of my political life, he wasn't only mourning lost nations. He was mourning trust. The man he once called the friend of freedom had traded Europe's heart for peace in the Pacific. For Roosevelt, it was strategy. For Churchill, surrender by another name. And for millions behind the Iron Curtain, it was the day one war ended, and another, colder one began. Fact 7. The Lend-Lease Trap. In 1941, when Britain stood alone against Hitler, Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program looked like salvation. "We shall give you the tools to finish the job," the president said. The phrase became legend, America's benevolent arm reaching across the Atlantic to feed and arm a desperate ally. But behind that generosity was a shrewd calculation that would leave Britain indebted, weakened, and ultimately dependent. The deal was simple on paper. America would supply food, weapons, and raw materials for the duration of the war. In practice, it became an invisible chain. Britain would not pay in gold or money, but in access to bases, trade routes, and global influence. Each shipment of tanks or planes came with conditions, often hidden in the fine print. British holdings in the Caribbean, Newfoundland, and even the Indian Ocean quietly shifted into American hands. Churchill accepted the terms because he had no choice. In 1940, Britain's reserves of foreign currency were nearly gone, and the Luftwaffe was burning London from above. Roosevelt knew this. He played the part of the patient friend, sympathetic but firm. "We can't fight a war for the old order," he told his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau. "We're not restoring the British Empire, we're replacing it." As the war dragged on, the numbers ballooned. By 1945, Lend-Lease had delivered more than $30 billion in aid to Britain, over half of it spent in the United States. When victory came, Roosevelt abruptly ended the program, demanding repayment in peacetime trade concessions. Overnight, Britain went from ally to debtor. The pound collapsed, and London was forced to take a massive American loan just to survive the first months after the war. Churchill was devastated. He had believed Lend-Lease symbolized trust, that the arsenal of democracy would stand by Britain until peace was secure. Instead, he realized it had been a slow transfer of power from one empire to another. When the final shipment was stopped in August 1945, the telegram was blunt. All Lend-Lease terminated immediately, No warning, no gratitude. British ships at sea were ordered to pay cash before they could refuel. The humiliation was complete. Britain, the empire on which the sun never set, now owed its existence to a creditor across the ocean. "They have us by the financial throat," Churchill told his staff, "and they call it friendship." To Roosevelt, Lend-Lease was genius, a war won through economics as much as arms. To Churchill, it was a slow suffocation disguised as aid. The world saw alliance. He saw the quiet birth of American supremacy. Fact 8. The betrayal in the Pacific. While Europe burned, another war was unfolding, one that would test the special relationship to its breaking point. For Churchill, the Pacific was sacred imperial ground. Singapore, Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya, the jewels of Britain's Eastern Empire. For Roosevelt, it was an American frontier, a region destined for new influence once Japan was crushed. In 1942, both men called each other allies, but beneath every communique was a duel for dominance, a quiet struggle over who would own the Pacific after victory. The tension began with the fall of Singapore. Churchill called it the greatest disaster in British military history. Roosevelt, while publicly sympathetic, privately saw opportunity. The American Navy was now the senior force in the Pacific, and Washington began reorganizing the command structure to reflect that. Britain's role was reduced to a supporting presence. British officers in Ceylon and India reported that American commanders bypassed them entirely, sending orders straight to Australian and Chinese forces. Churchill pleaded for a joint command, a combined empire and U.S. front. Roosevelt refused. "Too many cooks," he said. "Let's keep the theater simple." The simplicity meant American control. By 1943, Roosevelt's planners, especially Admiral Ernest King, openly opposed deploying British fleets east of Suez, fearing it would complicate U.S. operations. King distrusted Churchill's motives, believing Britain wanted to reassert colonial power once Japan fell. Roosevelt didn't correct him. He quietly agreed. Then came the final blow. In early 1945, as the Allies closed in on Japan, Churchill asked Roosevelt for a symbolic gesture, a shared declaration that British forces would take part in the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Roosevelt delayed, dodged, and finally refused. He told his advisors, "When Japan surrenders, the American flag must be the only one they see." That decision cut Britain out of the Pacific victory it had helped fight for. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Churchill was no longer prime minister. He had been voted out weeks earlier. But even as he listened from his country home, he understood the message. The Pacific, once ruled by British fleets, now belonged to the United States. Later, he wrote bitterly, "The empire of the seas has passed from us. The trident has changed hands." Roosevelt hadn't betrayed Britain out of malice, but out of destiny. He saw the Pacific as America's horizon, not Britain's inheritance. Churchill saw it as theft disguised as liberation. When the war ended, U.S. bases stretched from Hawaii to Okinawa, from the Philippines to Micronesia. The Pacific was no longer imperial, it was American. And Churchill finally understood what Roosevelt had built, not an alliance of equals, but the architecture of a new empire, one made of dollars, not colonies. Fact 9. The spy war between friends, allies in public, rivals in secret. Behind every speech of unity, Roosevelt and Churchill were fighting a quieter, colder conflict, a secret war of intelligence, deception, and mistrust. The special relationship between their spy agencies, MI6, and the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, began as cooperation. It ended as quiet espionage, each side watching the other more closely than the enemy they shared. At the start, Britain led the world in intelligence. MI6, Bletchley Park, and the legendary codebreakers of Ultra held the secrets that won the Battle of the Atlantic. When the United States entered the war, Roosevelt demanded full access. He told Churchill, "There must be no secrets between friends." Churchill agreed, reluctantly. He needed America's resources and couldn't afford a refusal. But he understood what the phrase really meant. British intelligence was being absorbed by a power far larger than his own. In 1942, Roosevelt created the OSS under William's Wild Bill Donovan, a bold, chaotic figure who believed American intelligence should operate everywhere, even inside Allied territory. Soon, OSS officers began running missions in North Africa, Italy, and even London, sometimes without informing British command. MI6 protested, calling it undisciplined adventurism. Donovan replied, "We report to Washington, not Westminster." The cracks widened. OSS agents began recruiting informants within the British Foreign Office and the colonial administration. They gathered data not on Germans, but on Britain's post-war plans in Asia and the Middle East. Roosevelt's advisors wanted to know how far Churchill intended to go in restoring his empire once peace came. When British security discovered that American officers had tapped telegraph lines in Cairo and Calcutta, Churchill was enraged. He sent a furious cable to Roosevelt demanding an explanation. The president denied knowledge, calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the truth was clear. The United States was already preparing for a post-war world in which it would need to know and control Britain's every move. In response, MI6 began quietly countering American infiltration. Some British officers even fed the OSS disinformation, planting exaggerated reports about imperial plans to see where the leaks led. One MI6 memo from late 1944 reads simply, "The Americans are our friends, but they collect as if we were their enemies." By the time of Roosevelt's death in April 1945, the trust between their intelligence networks was largely gone. The OSS would soon evolve into the CIA, modeled on British methods but driven by American ambition. MI6, once the world's premier service, found itself outmatched and overshadowed. The irony was cruel. The intelligence war that began as cooperation against Hitler ended as a rehearsal for the Cold War. This time, not between East and West, but between two supposed allies. Churchill would later call it the quiet betrayal, the moment when friendship turned into surveillance. The shared victory over Germany had barely been declared, yet the first spies of the next war were already in place, and they all spoke English. Fact 10. The final silence at Hyde Park, September 1944. The war was tilting toward Allied victory, but the alliance itself was breaking apart. Roosevelt and Churchill met privately for what would be one of their last true conversations at Hyde Park, the president's estate in New York. The two men, weary and older than the war had any right to make them, spoke of peace, power, and the world that would come after. Yet beneath the soft light of the Hudson Valley, another betrayal was quietly sealed. Churchill arrived desperate to preserve what remained of Britain's global stature. He needed American partnership to balance the Soviet threat, and he believed that only personal friendship with Roosevelt could save it. He raised the subject of nuclear research, the tube alloys project that Britain had pioneered before the Americans took it over, and renamed it the Manhattan Project. Churchill wanted a post-war agreement ensuring joint control of atomic energy, fearing that Britain would otherwise become merely a spectator in the age of ultimate power. Roosevelt listened, nodded, and promised cooperation. Together they drafted a brief memorandum, known later as the Hyde Park Aid Memoir, stating that the US and UK would continue to collaborate on atomic weapons even after the defeat of Japan. It was short, vague, but Churchill believed it binding. "We have secured our equal place in the atomic age," he told his aides on the flight home. He was wrong. Months later, after Roosevelt's death, the new American administration under Harry Truman claimed no record of such an agreement. The document vanished into classified archives, ignored by Washington's officials who now viewed nuclear technology as a purely American possession. When Churchill raised the matter in 1945, Truman dismissed it with bureaucratic courtesy. There must be some misunderstanding. Britain was excluded from nuclear research, denied access to the weapon it had helped create. Churchill felt betrayed in a way words could barely contain. Roosevelt, The man he called his brother-in-arms had promised a shared future, but left him only uncertainty. Whether the president had intended to deceive him or simply knew his signature would not survive his death remains a mystery. What is certain is what followed. The United States became the sole atomic power. Britain, drained and indebted, was forced to dismantle its global bases and retreat into austerity. The empire Churchill had fought to save now depended on American protection and American permission. In his final memoirs, Churchill wrote of Roosevelt with both affection and pain. He believed he could shape destiny with charm and faith. Yet in the end, he shaped a world where our island no longer ruled the waves. The silence at Hyde Park was not an argument, nor a betrayal shouted in anger. It was a quiet understanding that the old world was ending, and only one of them would stand in the new. Roosevelt had won the war and the century. Churchill had won the words history would remember, but not the world they described. History remembers Roosevelt and Churchill as brothers in arms, two men who saved the free world. And in a sense, they did. But behind their partnership lay a deeper truth. They were also architects of each other's undoing. Churchill fought to preserve an empire. Roosevelt fought to replace it with a new order. Each believed he was serving freedom. Each betrayed the other to secure it. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the victory they shared no longer belonged to both. The British Lion limped from the battlefield, proud but fading. The American Eagle rose into the sky, carrying the torch Churchill thought he'd passed only for safekeeping. In the end, they didn't just win a war, they ended a world. And in the quiet between them, history changed its flag.